So my name is Matthew Downhour. I'm here with Christopher England. We're both members of the Robert Shackelbach Foundation board. Christopher has also written a fantastic book that I have here. And so I'll be interviewing him about that book. I've also written a review of it. So that's why I'll be conducting the interview, I suppose. So Christopher, tell me a little bit about, I guess, first of all, what's the, in your words, like what's the major story and major relevance of this book? It's obviously about things that happened mostly 100 and some years ago, but I felt like it was still highly relevant. I found a lot of threads that I thought were still important. I wanted to get kind of your thoughts on why this subject is topical, why it's relevant to us, and kind of the debates we have today.
Thank you for the introduction. When I first started it, I didn't think it was, but then I realized otherwise. My presumption about George, based off of what I had read about him in the past, was that he wanted to go back to a country of small farmers. He was very interested in this thing called land, which Americans were found really important when they all grew their own food. But diving into the sources and learning more about George, I realized that his concerns about land were not necessarily that everyone had their own farm, but that certain types of land had become a source of economic inequality, particularly scarce and highly valuable types of land, land in major cities, resource producing land near major commercial trade routes, places where commerce and value was centralized and where increasingly intensive use of land was creating valuable wealth that was accruing to a small subset of the American population. And this is something that is now very relevant today in terms of we have witnessed a sort of reemergence of cities as a major factor in global commerce. We've also seen rising resource prices as growing demand from a vibrant sort of world economy has increased the cost of commodities like steel and oil. And this has created opportunities for above average profits from monopolizing relatively scarce sources of finite land. And so diving into Georgism, I found it to be very much relevant to our contemporary questions of inequality.
Awesome. Yeah, that's kind of was my impression as well. I noticed, you touched on this sort of impression that when we think land, we first think like agriculture, right? But in fact, one of the things that struck me about the book was the extent to which, late 19th century and beyond, Georgism was an urban movement, really an outgrowth of an urbanizing economy. And the title here, the subtitle, is Henry George and the Crafting of Modern Liberalism. What I found interesting sort of was when we're looking at Henry George in his active years, there's a liberal party in Mexico, there's a liberal party in the UK, but there's not at the time, and it still really isn't today, like a liberal party in the US. So I found it interesting, sort of the crafting of an American liberalism when there had certainly been liberal ideas, but not really a liberal party. And you get into your book a little bit about how the way Americans viewed and dealt with the land issue before the late 1800s was a big part of like the way that the U.S. developed or failed to develop a liberal party like most other societies. Can you touch on that a little bit, this idea of how the yeoman farmer and that ideal sort of undercut a lot of the liberal currents that were happening in the rest of them?
Yeah, so those are good questions. Liberalism has always been very important in American thought in terms of the ways in which liberalism has emphasized the ideas of individual rights and democracy. And there have been countercurrents to those in throughout U.S. history, but those have also been quite important. ideas. And there's a line of historical argument that the reason why we don't have a liberal party is because it's just assumed that we're all liberals. That's an exaggeration, definitely, but that is, what one way historians have thought about this question. But as you know, there are major discrepancies between American liberalism and British liberalism, and that British liberalism is evolving in a context in which it's evolving out of aristocracy and feudalism, where land is intensely centralized in the hands of elites, and the emergent sort of middle class recognizes that economic opportunity and political change is tied up with the redistribution of land, which people like Adam Smith and John Stuart Mill, see as being most viable through land value taxation. And so land is seen as a source of inequality. In the U.S., you have a continent to conquer and sort of develop into individual farms, and so there's a sense that land and resources are boundless, and they can be just sort of given away to white farmers to create a stable middle class democracy. And this, in a lot of ways, is still the prevailing idea in the U.S. in terms of the way in which we've built policy around suburbs and sort of widespread individual proprietorship of homes. But the limits to this discourse become kind of obvious by the late 19th century, when the government's giving away free land, but most of those homesteads aren't successful because you have to be near a train track to really get those goods to the market, and that land is scarce, and the railroad has it, and they're selling it. Urban land is increasing in value. The ownership of steel sites are a huge factor in the development of industrial monopolies. Even communications monopolies, which we often see as kind of breaking down space and making land less relevant, are very much rooted in the ability to build kind of telegraphic lines, which require extensive, unique rights of way, which are very hard to establish, and make land monopoly kind of central for the development of a modern communication system. So these kind of Jeffersonian ideas of broadcast ownership, wide ownership of land, that have come into question, and it's only as these resources begin to be exhausted and the limits of that type of policy become apparent that Georgism sort of picks up steam as a movement.
Yeah, that was the impression I got from the book, and a very interesting factor when we look at sort of this to an extent American exceptionalism. And one thing that you note also is that George is more cognizant of the potential for class-based movements, although he kind of moves between different classes. There's sort of a message for the laboring class, there's a message for the middle class. It doesn't sound like he got a ton of purchase with maybe the highest crust of society, but something else that was sort of slow to come to American politics was a more explicitly labor focused and then a more middle class focused political movement. I thought that was also very interesting.
One kind of argument here is that we anticipate Marxism to be kind of the inevitable outcome of industrial strife, because that's what Marxists said would happen. That's not the case in the United States. That Georgism really eclipsed socialism as a movement with political influence and kind of social power through the first 2 decades of the 20th century. And so I think that, problematizes the idea that class conflict has to sort of play out in, the way predicted by Marx.
Yeah, and that was another thing that I noticed that was emphasized by a lot of George's compatriots and people who were theorizing after him was Georgist ideas as an alternative to sort of a top-down hierarchy. So the idea that you could solve some of these issues with inequality without adopting a more centralized model, which most, I would say most Marxists, and certainly after Leninism became the politically dominant strain, argued that an increase in centralization and planning was necessary for dealing with questions of inequality.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, I guess, how you see that. Do you see that playing out today? Do you see that that's still a conflict or an assumption that inequality necessitates a greater level of centralized control and central planning?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think George is coming at this from a very traditionally liberal perspective, where he's afraid of centralized power. He wants, he's concerned with this dynamic between the individual and the community, and he wants to maintain a balance there. And he sees the idea of kind of separate spheres, the idea that there are innately private versus innately public things as a way of balancing the idea of individual kind of autonomy with the power of the community to do what it needs to do. So land and, finite monopolies are inherently social in their character, whereas everything else is private. And so that's a way of kind of balancing power. This idea that's so influential in American government, balance power, extending that to sort of society and the economy. George was working at a time in which you would see increasing skepticism about the ability of liberal democracies to reconcile inequality. And you would see the rise of kind of various sorts of authoritarian nationalist movements that would use the power of the state, would argue against any sort of restraints on the power of government. A lot of those ended very badly. There are societies today like Russia and China that are following similar models, and it's not necessarily going very well there either. It's following a similar path of human catastrophe. I think that in contemporary times, you see similar concerns about the ability of liberal democracy to reconcile inequality and to reconcile social problems. You see that from both sides of the spectrum. There are some people who I think vigorously want to see something like the more balanced system of the New Deal come back into effect. But that sort of social democracy has kind of gone out of favor across the world at the same time. And it's, I think, not because Milton Friedman was, this remarkably persuasive person who won over everyone in the world. It's because there were systematic structural problems with that system when globalization and international markets began to create more national competition. And so I think the only way to kind of avoid these, various threats to democracy, whether they be sort of nationalist centralizers or kind of, broad, disenchantment with democracy based off of inequality, is a system that manages to recreate the public's ability to, fund social programs in a way that's consistent with market efficiencies. And that was the idea of land value taxation, that land is a deadweight on the economy, and you can sort of socialize its value and use it for the public good.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's that makes a lot of sense. And I mean, knock on wood, we can see those things emerging in coming decades. Another thing that struck me was in some of the Georgist officials that you sort of followed after George's death, followed their careers, people who have been influenced, especially municipal government, was how much they really believed in the egalitarian I guess, implications of George's theory. For example, many of them took George's writings and they and what George said, almost not in passing, but wasn't the main threat to his argument. What he said about like criminality and criminal justice as arising from these inequalities, these broader social injustices, and actually applying them in an urban setting and attempting to change the way that they enforce vice crime or change the way that they enforce education. I guess, can you help me position that sort of in the history of American political thought or American governance and what kind of the effect there was?
Yeah. So, one of the things that George does is he argues that, you know, America's always had a moralistic society in a lot of ways. But the presumption going back to, early American Christianity was that, abiding by faith would create a moral society. George kind of turns that on its head, and he says that immorality is a product of social conditions, and that if you want people to be religious, to be moral, to sort of treat other people well, you need to create a society that's conducive to that. That vice and crime and all of these things are a product of their society. And so, this is an idea that would become prevalent in America in subsequent years as Christians turned towards what was called the social gospel. Idea that Christianity and morality was sort of contingent upon constructing better and more egalitarian society. And there are ways in which George very clearly has an impact on this. Walter Rauschenbusch, who's sort of the founding figure in the social gospel, cited George as the person who brought him around to the cause of reform. It's even been suggested that when the term social gospel was coined, it actually referred to, gospel is a book, to Progress and Poverty, George's Progress and Poverty. So, I think that, I try to focus here on the movement rather than the broader impact, because the second question is big and hard to track and a little nebulous, right? But I think that there is a way in which George creates a culture that promotes the idea that poverty is a social problem that needs to be dealt with in order to create kind of a broader a society in which people can be expected to be virtuous and good.
Yeah, and that to me that runs into, there's a lot of clash with the alternative explanation at the time, and I think you still see it today, that instead more the eugenic argument, right? That there are individuals who are morally inferior. I think today that's rarely broached, but you'd see it sort of couched in terms of, oh, there's these cultures that are morally inferior, and that's the reason why we get these problems. And as you note, George really spends a lot of time in Progress and Poverty and in his other writings kind of confronting the social Darwinism of Herbert Spencer, especially even beyond just the land question, but looking more into like that fundamental belief about, questions of humanity and human equality. Even though Spencer sort of agreed with George about land at the beginning of his career and sort of drifted away from that. What's the importance of that? Like, why was it so important for the movement to sort of excite this, this thought process or this explanation that social Darwinism offered for why society functioned the way that it did?
Yeah. So a clear implication of social democracy, of social Darwinism, is a move away from democracy, right? The idea that all people are equal, that they have, inherent rights or individuality, and there's a presumption that, people are members of races, and sometimes the disappearance of inferiors is, a progressive fact. In fact, that it's kind of inherent in the philosophy that this is that people's dying off is part of what constitutes progress. And you obviously can't have an egalitarian society based on that principle. Spencer is, while anti-government, also moving towards, an authoritarian vision in a lot of ways in which business elites sort of dominate society. And so, obviously, this is a problem for George's more egalitarian instincts, and he takes he really kind of hones in on it in Progress and Poverty as kind of the system that he's trying to refute. He's trying to refute the idea that progress follows inevitably upon technological change, upon free markets. He shows that societies often decay when they become too inegalitarian, when elites develop that have too much control, or when the poor become too disenchanted with that society. And so equality really is the key to development, to change, to progress. And I think in the broader scope of the movement, what really drives the movement is a hope for really fundamental change, for a better society in which you can overcome racial differences, overcome ethnic differences, in which all people can have a chance. And without that kind of utopian vision, without the idea of really fundamentally breaking through the problems inherent in society, the movement never would have gone anywhere. Because it really took people being devoted to these ideas and really fighting for them, to take ideas that are maybe not obvious, maybe not intuitive to a lot of people, and really put them into the public sphere and make them influential in a lot of ways. Without that hope of redemption, I don't think it would have gone anywhere. People have been talking about land value taxation for over a century. But it's George who really turns it into a vibrant movement by attaching it to these aspirations for a better society.
And one of the ways that George is often in sort of a survey history of American history, right? And I teach American history, so I read a lot of these surveys. The movement is sort of conflated or added to this stream of progressivism. That there's this progressive era that lasts from say 1885 to 1920, and Georgism is one part of that. But one thing that you really dive into is how Georgists in that era are pushing back against some of the tendencies of other progressives, especially those that are kind of embodied in like Theodore Roosevelt and some of his policies, and lots of others as well. So what kind of set Georgists apart from the rest of the progressive movement, to the extent that I think that would be almost a misnomer to say that Georgists were progressives, even though they were operating at the same time and maybe had some strategic alliances with the rest of the progressive movement?
Yeah. So progressivism is a complex thing. It has a lot of different variants. And sometimes Georgists call themselves progressives, but usually they kept on calling themselves liberals or radicals. And radical is a term during this period for kind of an extreme liberal. In a lot of ways, some of their key opponents were a certain type of academic progressive. They had campaigns to try to fire Richard Ely. They really hated some of these people. This is not a unified movement. These are two branches of a political spectrum that are really at odds with each other. And this sort of academic progressivism, a lot of it is rooted in academics during the time going to Germany. Germany has developed modern university system that will be replicated and brought back to the United States at Johns Hopkins, and then implemented throughout the nation. And Germany at the time is a lot like China today. It's recently become centralized under a pretty authoritarian government. It's experiencing rapid growth because of that centralization. And it convinces many of the progressive academics who study there the future, right? They come to be much more skeptical of democracy, especially an egalitarian franchise. They adopt lots of racial thinking and eugenics, and they really take aim at the idea of liberalism broadly as ideas of limitations of government, individual rights. They focus on idea of the nation as a collective, and that real kind of progress means embodying the collective will through the power of the state, and any impingements on the power of the state are kind of an affront to the nation. This goes pretty radically against George's ideas of individual rights, of markets working freely in most sectors of the economy, and also against the more egalitarian instincts of Georgists who don't approve of this top-down framework. And, I think that academic progressives bring back some useful technical innovations. They do manage to put in sort of layers of expert management in places where it had not existed before in ways that are productive. But by the 1920s, even many progressives recognized that there were problems with this unfounded faith in government. As government was misused during World War I to suppress dissent. As people began to sort of recognize the sometimes irrational and dangerous qualities of government during sort of extreme moments in history. A lot of them also realized that this boundless faith in scientific experts was sometimes, exaggerated, and that part of science is questioning, not just believing. And so, by the 1930s, I argue that in a lot of ways, both of these ideas go into the New Deal, and that you have the New Deal adopting certain types of a planned economy in the NRA. And you also have the New Deal embracing major sort of socialization of land and natural resources in the Tennessee Valley Authority, government-owned towns. And when it comes down to it, the TVA worked a lot better than the NRA.
Yeah,
expert management of the economy just failed. First in the NRA, and then World War II, when it was trying to get even its most avid supporters were like, oh no, this just doesn't work.
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting. Yeah, towards the end of the book, you get into the New Deal, and it seemed like anyway one of the major questions was about electricity generation and ownership of those resources, especially hydroelectric resources, that are obviously extremely site specific, right? There are a few sites where they can be, and they, absent the sites, all the concrete in the world isn't going to make a hydroelectric dam. Yeah, I would be interested in hearing more about like that. It sounds like there's something of a struggle about how the ownership of these sites would work, with both the importance of the specific site and the network effects of owning the distribution, and how some of these Georgist ideas were implemented in things like rural electrification and the TVA.
Yeah. So, before the TVA, large parts of America didn't have electricity. And this was a major impediment to the development of a consumer society, into, lifting demand for goods during the Depression, because a lot of these goods just wouldn't be useful to many Americans. And the Republican idea during this is that private industry should do it. Progressive Republicans sometimes argue that it should happen with government experts regulating it, but that private business should do it. And in the 1920s, Henry Ford tries to buy a site in Tennessee that had been constructed by the Georges Newton Baker when he was Secretary of War during World War I. And Georges are involved in, in a sense, a fight to, particularly Newton Baker, to under public ownership. And it becomes kind of a major flashpoint of progressive politics in the 1920s. Franklin Roosevelt, when he runs for governor of New York, kind of, his big policy proposal in a lot of ways is public electricity along the St. Lawrence River. And he campaigns on this, and he, when he becomes president, he works to, finally put the dam that Newton Baker built under public ownership and build this extensive network of hydroelectric plants. And this was a fight that Georges had been at the forefront of, and also they had established many of the precedents in terms of public ownership of electricity that would be cited throughout the debates about what would happen to the dams in the Muscle Shoals region.
Yeah, that seemed to me particularly relevant because, of course, we're hopefully on the cusp of a major power transition. And so that precedent for how public ownership and ensuring that there's public benefits of that is not only maybe equitable, but also efficient. That it's not always going to be the most efficient path to let private industry own and develop all this. There may need to be a public element to that because we're dealing with some very scarce goods or some natural monopolies. I thought that was particularly relevant to a lot of what we're seeing today. Also, yeah.
Well, just to add to that, private industry very intentionally did not build in many parts of the United States because it would have been inefficient to extend electricity in rural areas because you have to build a lot of line. You have to buy up a lot of land. So it was never a technical problem about how do we get electricity to these people. It was that business didn't see it as profitable. And so, I think we've seen so far that, private investment is not really kind of sufficient to sort of change the energy infrastructure at the speed that we need. And so I think we're in an analogous position where it's clear that government involvement needs to be, the government needs to be involved in promoting these technologies.
Right. And as you sort of alluded to, part of the impetus here was that there were going to be broader economic effects to electrification that couldn't be captured by private industry, but would be captured by the public as a whole. Something like extending washing machines and all of those. There are externalities. There are positive externalities to electrification, and there's negative externalities to a lot of other kinds of investment that are never really going to be priced into a market without a solid public sector kind of directing it when that needs to happen. But then, as it sounds like the Georgists noted, it was also necessary to make sure that public subsidy or that public direction wasn't siphoned off, right? It didn't simply create a rentier class that was going to benefit from this necessary public investment.
Yeah. And, part of, the Georges ethos was the idea that, land, that nature is like a public resource is something that that belongs to the public, and therefore private kind of infringements on it are problematic. Through pollution, for example, Newton Baker complains about, he's asked if they'll start taxing the air in Cleveland, and he says it wouldn't be worth anything because of what you've done to it. And Newton Baker and Tom Johnson do tax water. They tax riparian rights, ownership over water rights, because that's also a public natural resource that people can take advantage of, that increases the value of their property, that can be used for markets or just for recreation.
Yeah, and you mentioned Tom Johnson, who I think it's sort of one of the stars of the book, and the kind of consistent, it seemed like anyway, one of the consistent conflicts that we saw in that era and that we see maybe even more heightened today is that these urban areas, places where people are working, working and living in close proximity, these ideas spread. And you talk about they spread by just, your everyday person is just reading, protection of free trade, just in their, on their union break, right? But that fosters sort of a popular democracy that allows for the election of people like Tom Johnson or mayors throughout the country. But that these areas are often on sort of a collision course with their state governments because there's not the same purchase outside of these areas. And to me, it seemed like there was sort of a sense of a difference in how much maybe a typical person was interacting with others in these two different sort of environments. And I believe you mentioned it sort of as suburbanization takes root in the United States, ideas like of the Georgists become more difficult. It becomes more difficult for them to accomplish them through a democratic means because sort of the necessary informal civil society doesn't exist to the same extent that it did in Georgia's sort of heyday. Am I interpreting that correctly? I'm remembering that correctly. That's sort of like what you're saying here.
I think that's fair. I think that the main reason why suburbanization and agriculture undercut calls for land value taxation is that when people own land, they don't want to pay taxes. But I do think that the ways in which government has sort of put its finger down on sort of the process of decentralizing population has in a lot of ways eroded the kind of democracy that we saw in places like Cleveland. In America today, the FHA, well, historically, FHA has subsidized home ownership, it subsidized the suburbs, and historically it did so in ways that were very biased against cities. The FHA refused to offer loans in mixed race areas, in areas with row homes. You had to have detached single family white community for the government to loan you money for your suburban home or for your home in general. Of course, you still have the farm bill and other kind of rural subsidies. You have disproportionate spending on rural infrastructure to keep those kind of elements of society vibrant in a way that they wouldn't be if the playing field was level, right? And I think that is detrimental to democracy. I think in places like Cleveland, you saw how in cities people can convene, they can have meetings, they can get together and have a vibrant civic life in a way that's more difficult in suburban community. And I think empirically, if you look at contact theory, there's a substantial amount of empirical tested evidence that the best way to reduce prejudice and sort of racial inequities is by ensuring that people of diverse backgrounds engage with people. Even see them in a public setting, and that's something that happens in cities, not in suburbs so much. Some of that's changing as the nature of suburbs have changed over recent years, but a lot of that's because suburbs have moved closer to being cities. Right. It's kind of the government incentives have changed.
Interesting. Yeah. What you're saying, it sounds like to an extent the post-war policy almost created kind of or recreated this or tried to recreate, I guess, this yeoman farming ethos again, but without the farms. But still, everybody gets their little piece of land, or in reality, 60 or 70% of people get this little piece of land, which is enough to be, a solid Democratic majority, but in a sense cuts off a lot of avenues for taking care of the other 30 or 40% of people who don't, right? And are largely in cities or are rural but not landowners. It's interesting that it almost seems like a repetition of that Jeffersonian, we can create a voting block with the land that we have but we're not really creating equality with that distribution.
Yeah, Franklin Roosevelt was very much inspired by Thomas Jefferson. He was kind of his lodestar politically and philosophically. And so, Roosevelt's long and abiding interest in decentralizing population, I think, does have, this shared ideological origin in Jeffersonian ideas. But, the suburban household is just fundamentally quite different from the homestead. It doesn't provide a source of income. It's not capital. It's just a consumer good. And it's a consumer good that increasingly Americans have had to go into enormous amounts of debt for long periods of time to pay for. And so this is created in a lot of ways a more conservative society as people are bound by debt, as they no longer have kind of an independent means of procuring their necessities. They no longer have their own capital. They're relying upon capital. They're relying upon big business to pay them salaries that will allow them to pay off their 30-year mortgages. So it's inspired by the same ideas, but it ends up in a pretty different place in terms of the balance of social power.
And you could argue maybe that it encourages people to use their house as a homestead to generate income, but the only way to do that is through appreciation, right? And so you create a class of people who desperately need their land to appreciate because it's not actually producing like a farm, and yet it is their major asset, so to speak. But when in reality, in most conditions, it make more sense to see it as a consumption good. Because there's so much money in it, people want it to also be a revenue generator, or at least a equity generating asset, which is probably not a healthy foundation for your economy.
Yeah. I think that creates a lot of perverse incentives in terms of using politics to, stifle housing supply, to, extend the value of your finite resource, right? Your home, and scarce housing. I think housing policy, it's fine to regulate housing policy if it's for the communal good, if you're not getting any extra profits off of it. But if in reducing the supply of housing, you're increasing the value of your own house, and you're not sort of passing any of that value along to anyone else, that creates the wrong sort of incentives for society in terms of empowering local governments to sort of use the power of the state to ensure that people can't live in locations. So there's just no housing, and that housing values are high and housing options are scarce.
And that gets somewhat back to sort of the Georgian solution in the 19th century, right? Is that the problem is not that people own a house. It's that in some way society lacks the mechanism to distribute that value, and so it pools up in a few plots of land or in the equity of a few homeowners rather than the society as a whole. And that seems like something that was broadly, I don't know if I want to say broadly, it was recognized in the particular locations where it was most acute in the 1800s, but it never became, there was not a long-lasting solution, I guess. And so here we are today, with maybe only a fragment of that solution implemented in a few places.
Yeah. The idea of giving everyone 160 acres of land, which the federal government did in the Homestead Act, or giving everyone a suburban home, it plays out differently in 160 acres in Manhattan is not 160 same as 160 acres in Iowa, right? Right. That's not egalitarian, and this idea of widespread ownership just doesn't really sort of work or sort of grasp the complexities of an economy in which land is valued differently, in which some types of land are incredibly scarce and incredibly valuable and have major social import that it's hard to see why one individual should be able to monopolize that value.
Right.
Should one individual be able to maintain a home that will block the development of a train that will benefit everybody? Is that individual's right to, that home more important than the value of, transportation for an entire state?
Right. And yeah, you bring up transportation. It sounds like of the things that we don't maybe think about as related to Georgism, but that a lot of these Georgists, I wrote into the book, you can't see it, but all of these Georgists that you mentioned in your book, in addition to land values, they're looking at, as you said, communications and transportation as sort of natural extensions of this philosophy. And it sounds like they did accomplish, quite a bit of what made the first half of the 20th century American cities so successful economically. Can you elaborate on those accomplishments a little bit in those, in these maybe not so land focused, but still following this kind of Georgist approach to political economy?
Yeah. So, Georgists are involved in a variety of issues in terms of both, taxing land, which they do manage to do, kind of often covertly through assessors, but also sort of changing transit systems, ensuring that transit monopolies, which are based off of, owning a particular piece of land or renting it from the city, accrue to everyone rather than just to the people who have the transit franchise. And they do that sometimes through price controls. Tom Johnson fights for 3-cent fare in Cleveland, but really the goal in the long run is to make sure that those are under the ownership of the public, which is now something we take for granted. And in a lot of ways, Georgists are really key in that development in terms of being really the forefront of public fights for ownership of publicly owned railroads. Tom Johnson is a major national celebrity, really kind of the, in a lot of ways, the most prominent mayor in the country based off of his fight for public ownership. And, this is, I think, a huge development. You do see places where there's been a trend backwards towards privatization of these sorts of resources, like in England. And I think these experiments have all gone very poorly because, having a private monopoly is a lot worse than having a public one, right? It's one thing for, the government to have all the power over one industry and use that for the benefit of everyone. It's a totally different thing for a private company to have that power and to leverage it for their own private gain.
And if I may ask an unfair question, because it's not in the book, but I'm just curious, given your research, do you see, anyway, to me, it seems there has been something of a revival in urbanism, in seeing transit and city governance and the making of a city function properly. Seems to be anyway picking up steam. That's something that more, especially younger people, are interested in, as younger people are more interested in living in cities. Do you see lessons there, or lessons here rather, for this movement or for this the future of building or revitalizing cities? I guess in the U.S., but also obviously this is going to happen in places where new cities are growing very rapidly. Do you see advice or do you see potential lessons here that are applicable?
Yeah, so I'm not unique in arguing that maybe the old New Deal state is on its way out. For example, the historian Jefferson Cowie has argued that the New Deal is a great exception in U.S. history that's unlikely to be replicated. And one of the things that he points to is the direction of reform in America today is now usually in sort of urban policy. That is no longer the federal government that's really taking the lead on a lot of issues. It's increasingly cities that are using their power to try to create change. I think that is probably the future of American reform, based off of the state of the federal government and how unrepresentative it is, and the nature of our political divides nowadays. And so here you see kind of a precedent for that, right? People who saw the cities as not only a useful way of creating reform, but a more democratic way of creating reform, a more inclusive way that can really sort of bring people into communal debates in a way in which they were often left out during the New Deal, when questions were handled on a level well above kind of the reach of the average citizen. And so I think that they are, in that sense, kind of a model for where not only we can go, but we probably will go in the future of American politics.
And not even just huge cities. I think you mentioned Denver as a city in the early 1900s, right? That although it had maybe a couple 100,000 people, but it still had this democratic and civic idea, right? That we are a unit, a city that works together. Mm-hmm. And I thought that was, I mean, I hope you're correct, because I see a lot of that as well. Where, as you mentioned, people are in contact, they're interacting. Maybe they're more likely to see these inequities and see places where we can reform and fix them.
Yeah, one of the key players in this story is Newton Baker, who is a lieutenant of Tom Johnson and went on to serve in the administration. And he coined the term civitas as basically a municipal, analog for patriotism. The idea of a sense of identity or loyalty or commitment to a city as opposed to a nation, which is a little bit idiosyncratic at a time in which so much of the world is increasingly looking towards nations. Though, the other interesting part of this story is that he would also go on to become kind of a leading force in fighting for the League of Nations and fighting for internationalism. And I think one thing I've noticed since I was much younger watching urbanism develop was that there seems to be a connection, a rootedness in kind of cities and kind of a global mentality that people are increasingly identifying with their city, but in a way in which they also see themselves as part of broader global currents that kind of leapfrog sometimes senses of national identities. And I think that that's something that Georgism embodied in a lot of ways. And I think it's something that is becoming more prevalent today as well. And I think it's because of just sort of the character of cities, the ways in which they're both cosmopolitan and diverse, but also localized.
Fantastic. And of course that globalization, it can go a lot of directions, but if the goal is, as we put it, sort of like finding these ways that we can find both equality but also efficiency, right? And freedom. I don't know, maybe it's the impossible triangle, but maybe it's not, right? That we in fact can have a prosperous and but also free society. And it sounds like that's a lot of what you're writing about was the goal of Georgists, and maybe a prominent future for that kind of problem solving.
Hopefully.
Hopefully. Well, thanks a lot. I think that's about our time. Really enjoyed the book, and enjoyed talking to you about it.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, it was great talking.